I'm like debating whether I should say this because it might get locked off. But when I'm 7 years old, the CIA tried to recruit me. And
Really?
Yeah.
And then just like that, Courtney drops that massive bomb right there at the end of the interview. Now, if you want to find out a little bit more and how maybe the CIA might have been trying to recruit Courtenay Turner, you have to check out this episode. And we're going to have her back on the show because she just threw that out at the very end of the episode. We didn't really get a chance to go dig deep into that. So we're going to have her back on to talk a hell of a lot more about that. Okay. Now, this interview was by far my favorite to date. I truly enjoyed talking to Courtney. Wow, what a conversation we had. If you do not know Courtney Turner's work, you have to. You must. So go to the description below, click the link, and check out all her work. She puts out a massive amount of content. She's a great researcher, does some super deep dives, and honestly, her podcast and the material that she puts out, it's heavy. Like she goes deep. So yeah, check that shit out. Now, as far as for this conversation, we covered quite a few subjects. We talked about Courtney's early life and how she went from all of her life experiences into podcasting. We discussed some philosophy, of course, a little psychology, and we definitely got into John Coleman. We got into the Tavistock Institute. Now, that's a subject that you're going to be hearing a hell of a lot more about here on The Study of Stuff. I'm going to be focusing heavily on social engineering, culture creation, and New Age deception. Because that's a subject that I've been into for many, many years. And it's kind of important that we start talking about some of this stuff, as well as my own personal experiences, which is one of the reasons why I've taken a little bit of a break from podcasting. I'll put a video out about that very soon. But another thing I wanted to mention about this episode is that we had some weird technical difficulties, like on both of our ends, not just on mine. We had some dropped calls. At one point, Courtney even said her computer just shut down and restarted on its own. It was strange. I don't know how to explain it. I remember back in the early days when I started learning about Tavistock, I'd hear these stories about people, if they named the Tavistock Institute in message boards, they'd be kicked out. So I don't know if it has anything to do with that. But anyways, here's the episode. My interview with the great Courtney Turner. Enjoy.
I'm like debating whether I should say this because it might get locked off. But when I'm 7 years old, the CIA tried to recruit me. And
really?
Yeah.
Okay, so to find out a little bit more about that, you're gonna have to watch the whole interview. And you know what? It's right at the very end. She drops that, just like it's no big deal, and then we end the interview. So hopefully we'll be having Courtney Turner back on the podcast to talk a little bit more about that. All right, I wanted to say a few words before we get into the full episode. This, by far, was my favorite interview to date. Incredible. Not only because Courtney is a fantastic guest. She is extremely knowledgeable, well-researched. She's a hard-working woman. She puts out a lot of content. And honestly, she was just a delight. It was amazing talking to her. I really enjoyed it. We definitely got into some interesting subject matter. We talked about her early days, her early history, and how that led her to podcasting. We talked some philosophy, of course, some Plato, moved through that to some psychology. And then, of course, we discussed John Coleman and the Tavistock Institute. That's a subject that'll be continuously brought up and discussed on The Study of Stuff moving forward. Social engineering, culture creation, and for myself particularly, how it pertains to New Age deception. In this interview, we do scratch the surface of that subject of social engineering and the Tavistock Institute. I look forward to discussing more on the subject with Courtney and many other guests moving forward. It has been a game changer in my life doing that research. It has changed my beliefs, my perspectives on many subjects immensely, learning and understanding exactly how we've been socially engineered. But this episode with Courtney was also interesting because for some bizarre reason, we were both having on both of our ends technical difficulties, strange ones. All of a sudden calls would be dropped, not only on my end, on her end as well. At one point, she even said that her computer just completely shut down and restarted on its own. It was just weird. I don't know if it has anything to do with the discussion of the Tavistock Institute. Could be. I don't know. I remember back in the old days when I first started learning about the Tavistock Institute in the early and mid 2000s, there was a lot of rumors going around that whenever that word was mentioned in a message board, you were either kicked out or censored in some way. And this is before like the censorship was so prevalent as it has been in the last couple of years. I'm talking about like early to mid 2000s. There's a lot of people that have made reference to the fact that when they mentioned the Tavistock Institute, situations would occur. I don't know if that's the case, and I don't know if it had anything to do with the little bomb that Courtney drops at the very end of the episode, which I gave you a little bit of a teaser in the beginning, and we'll get her back to talk more about that. But anyways, without further ado, my wonderful and amazing conversation with the wonderful and great Courtenay Turner. All right, welcome everybody to the Study of Stuff. Very special guest today. I know I always say that, but I was really, really looking forward to this conversation for a long time. Actually, even before I reached out to her, and I had her on my mind just because I've been following her journey from almost the beginning. And
Wow.
I was like, I remember, I think it was 2021 or
Mm-hmm.
January, February, around that time. I think you had done your very first interview with Alex Newman, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And it's like, because I was looking into him a little bit, and then I kind of forgot about your podcast, and then all of a sudden it popped up again when you had interviewed Jay Dyer.
Mm-hmm.
But the reason I bring it all up is because I was impressed from the beginning. It kind of felt like you were just dipping your toes into this world, and then you kind of took the advanced route, if I could put it that way, and all of a
Mm-hmm.
sudden you're like going into some hard, serious subject matter. A lot of the subject matter that I'm very interested in, and I was impressed. I really liked your style,
Thank you.
and I was interested in your perspective. Actually, oftentimes you'd give a different perspective, being that it was kind of new to you, I guess, that world, I
Mm-hmm.
suppose.
Mm-hmm.
And it really impressed me. I always wanted to have a conversation with you, but I was kind of going through my own weird journey. I was kind of rethinking some of the things I've believed in and this and that. And I was like, it's not time yet. And then her name, of course, is Courtnay Turner. And so Courtney started posting about some research she was doing. And I started to notice a pattern that your research seemed to kind of follow the same research I was doing from a different perspective, but we're kind of on the same path. Like this, we were sniffing the same, the scent. Okay, we got to follow
Mm-hmm.
this trail here. And then I think you posted something about you're working on some really serious subject matter, and it was a really big deep dive. It was a huge subject, and that you may need some help. At that point, I was like, okay, I think that's my sign. I'm gonna reach out. I waited a couple weeks, and I reached out to Courtney, and I started off by saying that I'm kind of going through like a little rethinking, like I said, of a lot of my beliefs and values.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the subjects that we both have a huge interest in, which is the Tavistock Institute, was one of the reasons why I started to rethink a lot of the things I believed in. And I noticed that you were kind of, from a different perspective, going down the same path.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought I'll reach out to her and I'll let her know what I'm looking into and see what she thinks. And I described Tavistock, John Coleman, uh, social engineering, cultural creation, a couple of books, Gustav Le Bon, and so on and so forth, and psychology, behavioral psychology, and all of that. And she's like, "Yeah, I'm looking into all those things too." So, so we decided to maybe work on a project together. I don't know how this is gonna work itself out, but I'm really excited to see where it all goes. And Courtney, welcome to the show. Thank you for taking time out to be here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah,
And
that's really cool to hear about your experience in like following me. And then it's also interesting when you bring up Jay. I had actually the first episode I brought Jay on was to talk about Tavistock because
that's right.
once I found out about Tavistock, like I was just searching everywhere trying to find information on it, and not that many people covered it. And then I found an episode he had done where he covered, of course, Dr. John Coleman wrote, his book, which is on Amazon for a bargain price of just shy of $5,000 for anybody who's looking for it. Although
I
on my Telegram, I do have I can't believe you actually have the physical book. I actually, I like pin the PDF on my Telegram. But yeah,
That's awesome. Yeah, that
so
was actually so when mentioned that I was listening like I think the very first episode you had, I think I revisited your podcast when you were talking about Tavistock with Jay. I think that's when I was like, oh yeah, I remember her. She had the whole Alex Newman thing, and that's when I think I was like, oh, okay, let me follow her journey, just because like
Mhm.
you said, it's not
Mhm.
common to have a lot of people discuss the subject of Tavistock.
Mm-mm. Yeah, until recently, where they were being sued for the transgender.
Yeah.
Yeah, most people had never even heard of it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was surprised even Douglas Murray did a little post about the transgender Tavistock connection thing, and I was like, oh, yeah, wow, he's talking about that. That's kind of weird.
Who
Like
did?
Douglas Murray.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, he's British, so I guess that would make a little bit of sense. But yeah, yeah.
definitely. So usually I like to start off the show asking my guests to kind of really give like detailed journey. Like, tell me about your life. How did you go from birth to where you are now? And
Hmm.
yeah, don't hold any punches. Go. I'm people's stories. I think are extremely important. I
Hmm.
think understanding where a person comes from, their
I
perspective,
agree.
and how they end up where they are today is actually more important oftentimes than the actual like source material and getting down and dirty with
Than
the
what they
information.
know. Sure.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
How they came to know what they know is sometimes more important to understanding than what it is they know that they're sharing. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I would agree. Um, yeah, and I think because human beings are social creatures and mythological creatures, we learn by storytelling, we learn by proxy. So oftentimes we would miss something uh, that or we would, ascertain information that we wouldn't otherwise by hearing the story.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, well, my life began. This is actually how I began my college essay. That my life began as a series of challenges, and since then, I have continued to seek out mental, emotional, and physical challenges to surmount. And so the story goes that my mom had germ measles during first trimester of pregnancy. Um, I now preface it by saying the story because those who follow my podcast know I've gone pretty deep down the germ versus terrain theory rabbit hole. So, you know,
Yeah.
but for the purposes of sharing the story, I will relay the story as I learned it, and that is what they told my mom. That she had germ measles during the first trimester of my pregnancy. The way that supposedly it was all contracted was that my father was very sick. He had spent some time with the doctor, my mom's doctor, and the wife who had been traveling. She was also diagnosed with germ measles, and then my father got sick, and then my mom found a rash on her chest, much more mild symptoms than my father, but she was pretty convinced that she was afflicted, and so she went and had a titer tested. The doctor was dyslexic, read the titer as being 112, but it was really 121. If the doctor had read the titer correctly, my mom would have had an abortion. So when I was born, the doctor was covering up, and the hospital was covering for the doctor. And they kept saying everything was normal, everything was totally fine. And my mom noticed that one of my eyes was rolling up in the top of my head. And they kept telling her the baby's eyes don't focus. And she eventually determined that my eye looked a lot like her father, so my maternal grandfather, who had just had cataracts. They finally found a doctor who confirmed that I was born with cataract, and they did a cataract removal surgery when I was 3 months old. Cataract surgery back then was very different than it is today.
Yeah.
So they pulled the iris, they left debris, they had to go back and do what's called a retinal cleanup. When they did that, they found rubella pigmentation behind my sighted eye, and they determined that I was born with congenital rubella. That at that point, they were pretty sure that I was going to be completely blind, deaf, autistic, retarded. Forgive me, I know that's not,
No
politically
worries.
correct, but they meant it literally,
Yeah.
cognitively impaired, and that the best they could hope for me was to find a nice institution for me to spend my life. That's what they told my mom.
Wow.
So
Wow.
Fortunately, my mom did not agree. However, I was rendered with several complications from early age. So some of them included I'm hearing impaired, significantly hearing impaired. I wear bilateral hearing aids now, but I did not get hearing aids till I was almost 6 years old. I learned how to speak by reading lips. I had heart surgery when I was a year old. I was born with hypotonic limbs. So for those who aren't familiar, it's the opposite of hypertrophy. When the bros go to the gym to build their muscles, this is the opposite. My muscles were not developing. I had asymmetrical bone development, fine graphic motor impairment. There were several complications, but the big ones are definitely the hearing and visual impairment. So that was then my parents sued because they were covering up for the doctor, and it was considered a wrongful birth case. The lawyer was the same lawyer as Larry Flint's lawyer for Hustler.
Really?
Yes, and it was the same time, and that is what it was called. It was called the wrongful birth because the alternative would have been to abort me. So I only say that just because it's an interesting element to the story, and obviously it
Absolutely.
shaped a lot of my thoughts on how I view life and how I view
Hmm.
definitely abortion. But yeah, I don't see that I was a wrongful birth. I'm very grateful to be here. So
As are
uh,
we.
yeah. So so that was kind of my birth story. And yeah, I don't know where we go from here because there's obviously a lot, but it was definitely not a typical birth story. So there were a lot of, physical challenges from the get-go.
Well, so
Some of
as
how I'm sorry, yeah.
sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, we can go through a lot of that. Maybe I'll allow you to ask me questions if you want, but I can jump forward because beginning my podcast actually is related because I was
Yep.
in Santa Monica, California. The measures were quite draconian. The COVID measures were very
Oh yeah.
restrictive, oppressive. Everybody was wearing a mask. The lockdown, the social distancing, all of those things were, really pretty extreme compared to some other parts of the country. And because I'm hearing impaired, even though I wear hearing aids, I still depend very largely on lip reading
Right.
for clarity of speech. So while I wear the hearing aids, they may give me the volume. They don't necessarily give me, you know, uh, the clarity of speech, auditory acuity. And I get a lot of that from non-verbal cues, which were being masked, literally.
Yep.
And that was incredibly challenging for me. I'm also, because I'm blind in one eye, I only have about 60% the peripheral vision that somebody who sees binocularly would see.
Hmm.
So when I wear the mask, it further reduced
Right.
my peripheral vision, which was already limited. And that was very frustrating for me, especially since I really couldn't do a lot of like my aerial stuff. You're up in the air, like sometimes 26 feet in the air. And if my vision is already being restricted and I can't hear the teacher because they're wearing a mask, so it was just very isolating. I was very depressed. People were getting very frustrated with me because I couldn't understand them and they would feel like I could hear, they'd see me responding. I'm like, yeah, it's appropriate for you to be speaking. That doesn't mean I have any clue what you're saying,
Right.
So it was incredibly frustrating and challenging for me. And most of why I started the podcast, a lot of people had suggested I do it. And while the notion was actually quite terrifying to me, the idea of having naked face conversations with people was incredibly exciting. So, and I thought it might literally save my life. I mean, I was really, really depressed. I noticed that after about a month, we were a month into lockdowns, I was every day walking to, it was down the block to this liquor store. 'Cause it's the only thing that's open,
Of course.
right? Like
Of
the
course.
donut shops and liquor shops are open, but your dentist is closed. Yeah, it made all
Of
the
course.
sense in the
It
world. The
makes so
gyms
much
and the
sense.
dentists are closed, but
Yeah.
liquor shops and donut shops perfectly sensible to keep open. So, but they were open, and the owner was this. He took his mask off to let so I could understand him. He didn't make me wear a mask when I walked in, and he just talked to me every day. It wasn't necessarily deep conversation, but a little bit of chit chat every single day. And I noticed that at the end of a month, I had poured a glass of wine, and it was like one of my favorite wines, and I didn't enjoy the taste of it at all. And I realized it was because I was constantly going to the liquor store, and I don't normally drink at home, like alone, like
Right.
it's just not. But I was doing that because that's, that was, well, what I realized is that I was doing it because I was so desperate to have a conversation with someone. And it was someone who would
Yeah.
let me talk to them barefaced. And yeah, so when people were suggesting the podcast, that was one of the reasons that I started it. I was like, okay, well, even if I don't necessarily air the recordings anywhere, the notion of being able to have potentially meaningful conversations with barefaced people would be, very, very powerful for me at that time. So, yeah.
Well, that's quite the story, and I can relate to Toronto was under serious lockdown as well. I know California was one of the worst states, and Toronto was most definitely one of the worst cities in Canada, like hardcore. So I
Ugh.
totally understand. It was just like liquor stores, weed stores, and like that's it.
Yeah.
It's
Awful.
pretty
It
nuts.
was so awful. Yeah.
So how did you pick your first guest then?
Um, so I think I had actually done a couple of recordings that I might not have aired. They were more just like friends who I'd have conversations with.
Yeah.
I had no technology or anything. I mean, I didn't have a microphone. It was just a computer. And my there was a friend of a friend. He was in the episode with Alex. The first episode that I aired. So the first episode that I actually did was my story. And
Yeah.
I did that. That was actually really kind of a strategic move because a lot of the platforms you have to be approved to get the podcast.
Yeah.
And I was very concerned about the nature of my topics and not being accepted to the platforms. But I felt that my story might be a little bit more neutral, fit into more of the inspirational kind of genre, and hopefully they wouldn't be flagged.
That
So
answers a big question of mine because like every time you have your introduction, I was like, I like that you say all that stuff, but I'm like, there's a little bit of that, but it caught me by surprise. I'm like, why did she pose it that way? And I was, now I understand why. That's smart. That's a smart move.
that was my initial, yeah. The intro we're definitely going to redo. I mean, I think the intro also is that I really at the time wasn't necessarily sure which direction I was going to go with the
Yeah.
podcast. Um, but yeah, so my first episode was my story, and it was for that reason. I knew that I had to send something off. But then I was doing a show, and we did several episodes actually
Hmm.
with Eric Shine, who was in the podcast
Yeah.
with me with Alex. And he had recommended reaching out to Alex, that he had done some work with him before. And I had seen Alex speak before, and I was a really big fan of his work. I said, yeah, let's definitely bring him on. And the episodes with Eric, because it was kind of its own show, and that just never, we recorded it, but it didn't really end up going anywhere. So but that episode did, so I aired that. But that was kind of how the first guest came to be. Yeah.
Yeah. Now it makes a lot of sense, especially because I've heard that from a few people that started podcasts around that time. Because that basically one of the reasons people started the podcast was they were lonely. Like they weren't able to go out, they weren't able to see people, and it was like one of the very few opportunities they had to actually connect with someone. And like, how sad is that? That's
It's so sad. The other thing that was happening for me was that because I was so isolated and I was really depressed and lonely, is that I started to I was doing a lot of reading.
Mhm.
Like I sat down the very first day of the lockdown, and I thought that it would be the perfect opportunity to write. I still need to
Right.
find the time to write.
Me too.
But I literally at the end of 10 hours had a white screen staring back at me and decided that it was not the right time to write. Um, because I was just way too depressed and anxious.
Yeah.
I could just not just, it wasn't so much just my own emotions. It was I'm very empathic, and I could feel just kind of the weight of the world. I mean, it sounds kind of cliche, but it was a very dark time. And I think I was
Yep.
feeling so much of the pervasive anxiety and depression that was around me, not just, my own emotions. And it was really just not the right creative space. So I knew enough about, creative endeavors that you really can't force creativity. So I took a step
I hear
back,
that.
and that day I ordered at the end, well, that night after I had, a blank screen staring back at me after 10 hours, I decided I would do some reading, and I ordered 11 books. And I thought maybe the reading would inspire me. And of course, I start reading all this stuff, and then I wanted someone to talk to about all the things I was reading. So I chewed my mom's ear off, and I'm very grateful that she indulged me. But I also but then I felt kind of guilty about just like chewing her ear off on like all the books that I've read that she hadn't necessarily read with me. And, so I then started talking on social media. I started posting, some screenshots of things I was reading, commenting on them. And I really didn't expect them to be controversial because at that time it was more psychology, philosophy, really
Mhm.
wasn't too political. I was really just kind of searching and trying to revisit a lot of my earlier academic roots. And
Yep.
that was really what I was doing. So I really just didn't expect it to be controversial, but I think that your worldview seeps through, and people people like to argue. So, so you're on social media and it's like, you say orange and they say, no, it looks like an apple. It's a
Yeah.
so I people just started to uh, be very contentious and rebuttal, and I was a little baffled by it. But I started to think, well, I actually have a lot of thoughts on what's actually going on right now in the
Mhm.
more political context, and I've always felt like, at the time I was much more immersed in the two-party paradigm, and I always felt that one of the biggest problems with the political right was that they engaged in autocritique. And I
Yep.
knew that didn't work so well in the Maoist struggle sessions, so I didn't
Yep.
want to be a part of the problem. And I made kind of a vow to myself to start speaking out so that at least I wasn't contributing to the problem. As I started posting more politically oriented articles, and I really didn't start with much commentary. I really started with articles and just sharing information. And I was getting so much backlash that that I think in some ways really inspired the podcast as well, because it was like, okay, well, I want to have conversations. I don't want this just to be people behind screens like
Yep.
screaming at each other, proverbially through screens. So yeah,
Hello. Uh-oh.
I think you froze.
It crashed.
You there? Hello?
Hello. Oh
Did
no.
I lose you? I think I may have lost you.
Hello. Uh-oh.
Hey, hello?
My apologies yet again, Courtney. The boogeyman's coming out after us.
It seems that way.
Yes.
Mm, Hmm. Yeah.
Oh, good God. So where were
So
you were
yeah,
at?
I don't know what.
Okay, so I'll so basically you're letting us know that you want to have conversations. So go from there because I think that's a very important point that you're making because at that time a lot of people keep forgetting what it was like at in 2020 2021. Like so much has happened in the last 3 years and kind of people
Sure.
completely forget what it was like and how it felt for people. And you're right, a lot of people would be posting like I remember a lot of people posting like really basic stuff, nothing political at all, and people just losing it on them. And I'm like, what are you arguing with people? So I can totally see that happening to you. So
Yeah.
for what were you reading actually? Like what were you kind of like posting that was getting people so like
Um.
uppity?
Well, when I started posting political stuff, I mean, people who didn't agree, obviously. I
Okay.
mean, it was like, I think at that time it was probably a lot of the BLM stuff was happening and
Uh-huh.
the
Yep.
critical race theory, and yeah. So I think that was probably stuff that I was posting.
Okay.
Certainly stuff about COVID. I was posting stuff on that. The election.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that one.
I mean, it was definitely politically charged. But as I said, I didn't start that way. I started out posting stuff like, reading Nietzsche and like shouldn't have been. I was posting. I think I had just read Maps of Meaning, and I was
Hmm.
talking about that. Yeah, it really. Some of the stuff I was posting earlier on shouldn't have been political, but I think, as I said, I think worldviews come through, and so if people have an opportunity to be oppositional, they will.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah, yeah. So that's why, that was one of the things that I liked about your podcast. It felt like conversation.
Mhm.
It felt like just two people in a room having a conversation, just discussing a matter, as opposed to a lot of other people at the time. They were just kind of barking at a screen. Although I did like watching that as well, because I agreed with their view. But it gets a little boring, and then I like the back and forth. So it really came through on your podcast, and still does, of
Thank
course.
you.
So I
Thank
think
you.
that's it makes it easier for someone that's kind of entering this whole sphere of crazy information to kind of be able to kind of keep up and know how to kind of communicate or navigate through this mess.
Yeah, I hope that through a conversation, people, I think it makes it more accessible for a wider range of people.
Absolutely.
A lot of the material that I cover is pretty, some of it is more academic type material.
Yeah.
And I think there they could listen to a lecture,
Hmm.
but the benefit of it being conversation is that I think it is much more accessible to a lot of people. Whereas a lecture, not everybody will read, not everybody will sit through a lecture style course.
Absolutely.
So, but a lot of people will listen to two people conversing, and especially when those people are bouncing ideas off each other,
Exactly.
they're making discoveries along the way as well. So you're almost like a fly in the wall, getting to be a part of that journey where people are making the discoveries. So, and I think that for learning, that's really powerful.
Absolutely. And speaking of that, you said your past in terms of like academics. So you have a strong philosophy background. At least that's what comes through. And
Hmm.
oftentimes you reference that.
Hmm.
So philosophy and psychology as well. You often kind of touch base on both of those subjects.
Hmm.
So how did you get interested in philosophy? What's captured your attention?
So philosophy, my entry to philosophy was probably like really young, like 2, 3 years old. I was fascinated with Greek mythology.
Yeah.
And, some of my favorite movies, really cheesy, but like one of my childhood favorite movies was Xanadu.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but it is, I mean, very loosely, it is connected to Greek mythology.
Hmm.
She was a muse. She was the daughter of Zeus and Helen, and yeah. So, sorry, Zeus and Hera,
Here.
and
Yeah.
yeah. Um, so yeah, that was my early kind of foray into philosophy. Was really through Greek mythology from a very young age. I was reading all the Greek mythology, and that kind of led me into some of the Greek philosophy, the ancient
Hmm.
philosophy, and starting to study that. And I studied psychology really young as well, but I'll give you the philosophy journey, and then
Hmm.
they overlap, but not quite.
Yep.
So philosophy, I continued then to study a lot of the ancient Greeks, and then from there branched into other areas. But I would say even to this day, I'm really fascinated with the ancient Greeks. But my ninth grade, going into high school, the summer reading, like going into ninth grade, was Brave New World and the Tao of Pooh.
What
And
a
I
combo.
remember thinking I was gonna love high school. I was like, "This is awesome," and yeah. So I my history class had a lot of, I guess, the beginning of history was a lot of the philosophical references, and we had to pick a term paper in ninth grade, topic for a term paper. And I picked the pre-Socratic philosophers, and I wrote my term paper on the pre-Socratics' primordial search for transcendence.
Hmm.
And I think that that's really, actually, it was way more relevant to like everything that I'm investigating now than I would have ever could have ever known then.
Absolutely.
Uh, so, and then my sophomore year of high school, I wrote, it was for English class. So again, it was really my own journey, but I was fortunate enough to be in an environment where I was allowed to kind of carve my own paths.
Hmm.
And it was English class, so certainly it wasn't philosophy, but we in that English class, it was kind of like a periphery part of the course where I think it was every month, you basically did a book report. Sophomore year of high school, and obviously that wasn't like English class, but it was like on top of everything. You wrote a book report. That was part of and you got to choose. So it was kind of like an elective part of the class. And I read The Trial of Socrates, and it really did move me. I think it shaped a lot of my views and my perspectives. And I wrote a paper on that. My history teacher from the previous year ended up publishing it. I didn't know until I was a senior. I had
That's
no
awesome.
idea until it was really cool. The way I found out was that I was in the ladies' room and someone asked me if I was Courtenay Turner, and I said, "Yeah, why?" And he said, "I just quoted you," and I said, "You did? Why?" And he said, "Because we have to read your paper as our secondary source."
Oh, get out of here. That's
And I
awesome.
was like, "What paper?" I mean, I had no idea. I mean, it was a paper I wrote my sophomore year, and I was a senior at that time. I had no idea he published it.
That's
So
awesome.
it was pretty cool. And then my junior year, I did an independent study on philosophy. I used, I probably have it here. I don't know. I can never see my books, but it's right here. I always reference this for beginners, but it's Sophie's World.
Oh, yeah. I have that
Right?
in
I
Canada.
love
I
this
have that in
book.
Canada. Yeah, it's great. It's great. I gave it to my
So
daughter.
did you?
Yeah.
Did you like it?
She hasn't read it yet.
Oh, tell her it's so cute.
Yeah.
It really is. It's
It is.
such a cute story. And so I use that kind of as a guide for, it was the year, it was an independent study. And I use that as a guide for kind of like a review of the literature of philosophy. That had many other sources that but that was kind of the launching pad for that. And then my senior year, I did it was, what was the name of it? It was a Zeitgeist paper, and it was about how the turn of the century philosophers, artists, and literature reflected the zeitgeist of the 20th century, which was essentially like a despair. I don't remember the title anymore, but it was like man's search for meaning, essentially.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of a deep dive to a lot of philosophy as well. And then I ended up majoring in philosophy, but the psychology journey was slightly different. And I do think they overlap because I started to realize, obviously, philosophy is the father of psychology, is the father of all science, really, in
Absolutely.
its more authentic form. Both of us have done research that will indicate there's been a lot of artificial creation of science, both science and I would argue hard science and social science, certainly. Not to say that there isn't hard science that that exists outside of the framework of what has been systematized, but my psychology journey was because my mom went back to school when I was about 6 years old, and I was very, very close to my mom because I was sick. I was in and out of hospitals most of my childhood, so I spent a lot of time with her, and we're still very close, and she I tell the story. She said to me she was bored, and I really remember it. I remember it really well. And she said she was bored. It was dusk. We were outside on the deck. And normally when she was bored, we went to Bloomingdale's. But my mom doesn't really like to drive at night. So I knew we weren't going to Bloomingdale's. And I knew she meant more existentially. I don't think I knew that term at the time, 6. And I don't think I necessarily knew, I might not have had the cognitive reference for it, but I definitely knew that she meant something bigger. And I said, well, what do you want to do? And she said that she was thinking about going back to school, and she asked me how I felt about it. And I said that I didn't really want her to because, essentially I was going to miss her, and that, but I felt that, she should do it because she should do it for her. And she did, and I did feel like I lost her. She was my best friend. I spent all this time with her, and she didn't have the same amount of time for me anymore. So I started to read Freud when I was like 9, and I really basically was just reading whatever I could so that I would, I read Psychology Today, and then I would want to talk to her about it. I'm like, we can discuss your work, your schoolwork, and yeah, so that was kind of how I started studying psychology. And then in high school, I wrote two 85-page theses. Well, one year it was 80, the other was 85, on dream analysis.
Uh-huh.
So we had my school was, as I mentioned, I was very fortunate. The school gave me a lot of latitude with being able to do independent research, and I took a lot of that initiative to be able to do it because I just really prefer doing that to, the, straight and narrow stuff they gave us. So,
Of course.
uh,
Good for you. Good for you.
yeah. So I had presented, they had something called a focus project, which was essentially a dissertation format where first semester you do a review of the literature, second semester you do field study, and then you present before a panel and you defend your thesis.
Mhm.
So I had presented this idea because I was going to do a summer research project when I started to realize how much work it was going to be. I was like, I kind of want to get some credit for this, and presented it to my principal. And they said, well, we really would have to have somebody from the school overseeing it, that, having an outside psychotherapist was not, or licensed therapist would not be sufficient for me to get credit. And then we kind of brainstormed together for a while, and he came up with this idea of my doing a focus project as a junior. So I was the first junior in my school to do what was called the focus project, and it was on dream analysis. And my focus was on, it ended up being my first year was problem solving dreams. The second year was creativity in dreams. And the research that I had actually presented was I presented it to Columbia Presbyterian, and they laughed in my face. I was 15 years old, and they told me that it was a human brain study, and you need an MD, PhD to conduct the study. And they said, but if you did, it most likely would get a Nobel Prize because it would probably be statistically significant. And I was like, oh, okay, well, then that's what I'll do. So don't bother, because by the time you graduate, will have already conducted the study. And I remember, of course, at the time, I think I know my mom thought it was really flattering. I probably thought, like, I decided, well, that's going to be my path. I'm going to go, major in neuroscience, and I'm going to get my MD, PhD, and we'll conduct this study, and, they'll live happily ever after. That was the plan. But in hindsight, knowing what I know now, I think it was actually really ludicrous because it was basically just gatekeeping. There's
Yep.
no reason why I couldn't conduct that study. I wasn't going to slice
Absolutely.
people's brains.
Absolutely.
Bill Gates doesn't even have a college degree, and he certainly doesn't know how to code software. And he's like, right?
He's an expert, though.
So
He's an
he
expert.
doesn't have an MD either, and he's
You're not
all,
an expert. He's an expert.
right? Yeah, exactly. So somehow he's the medical expert, and he doesn't even have a college degree. So I mean, that's just a pretty extreme example, but I think it proves, it alludes to my point, because I do really think it's a way of gatekeeping, because why couldn't
Absolutely.
I have overseen the project? I
Yep.
could have. It was my hypothesis, and the professionals who were skilled and trained would have conducted this study. And certainly when I graduated, I worked, as research assistant in Columbia Presbyterian. And that's exactly what we did. Somebody had a hypothesis, it gets
Yep.
tested, and you have all
Yep.
these people working in the labs who are working directly. The person who's overseeing it doesn't necessarily, I mean, in some cases they do, but in some cases they don't. So it's interesting, just, in hindsight, how perspective shifts, and what knowing, if you knew then what at the time now. So, but that was initially the plan. So I wrote these two theses on dream analysis. My mentor was the founder of the Association for the Study of Dreams. I got certified in her method. It was the dream interview method.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yep.
and so, yeah,
I'm
so
familiar with
I
it.
wrote those. I presented just my thesis before a panel of mostly, some were neuropsychiatrists, some were psychiatrists, both years. And in college, I was given a grant to do research on dreams and literature.
Oh, get out.
So,
Cool.
so I did some work on that, and but I ultimately ended up majoring in philosophy. So that was a very long-winded, but yeah, that's kind of my journey into, yeah,
No,
philosophy
it
and
makes a lot
psychology.
of sense hearing it because it really comes through when you have conversations and your discussions, and you really do keep up with some heavy hitters when you're conversing with them. And I'm like, okay, this is so that's why I was interested in hearing your backstory on philosophy and psychology because actually you made a couple of comments on different episodes that made me
Mhm.
really rethink things, and a lot of the conversations that you've been recently having about Plato. Like my background's
Mhm.
Greek, so of course,
Mhm.
in a Greek household, and my father loved books, and there was always like a lot of conversations about Pythagoras and Socrates and Plato and blah blah blah. But I was getting
Sure.
it from a perspective of from a Greek perspective and from a father perspective who was trying to push nationalism on me. So.
Mhm.
Not in a bad way. I mean
Sure,
that
sure.
in a very good way. But
Sure.
we were kind of more learning about these individuals almost as if they're supposed to be like our heroes, rather than actually
Right.
kind of deconstructing and thinking through their thoughts and what do they actually mean. And it's only
Right.
recent that I've come, and actually your podcast has been very helpful on kind of rethinking how I'm viewing Plato. I mean, early on, I kind of noticed a couple of things that made me go, huh? But I didn't really like spend a lot of time thinking about it. And so let's kind of go there. So
Yeah.
recently, you've been doing a lot of podcasts about that, about Plato, his connection to well to where we are today, almost as if he was kind
Yeah.
of putting out the blueprint for the New World Order. And Jay's talked a lot about it as well as James and a bunch of your other guests. So from your perspective, at what point did you kind of see Plato in that light, in the light of like he might have been the archetype of this all?
So what's super fascinating to me, I don't know if it's fascinating to anybody else, but I'll share it with you. But just reflecting on my own journey through the intellectual material is that so I majored in philosophy and I wrote my thesis on existential authenticity. So I
Hmm.
really I was fascinated with the existentialists. And I really was it's ironic to me looking because I had such a inverted perspective, I think. And I do think a lot of that was clouded by how it was presented to me, by how
Hmm.
it was taught. So
Yes.
in the psychology classes, I really noticed pretty immediately how overwrought the field was with Marxism. It seemed like a Marxist indoctrination. But philosophy, in my philosophy classes, it absolutely was, and I couldn't put my finger on it at the time. But I knew that there was some sort of kind of a disconnect because when I initially presented my thesis, I presented it to they first like, tried to cut like half of it down. They were like, you can't do that much, you can't compare that many philosophers, just too ambitious. And my advisor just really was not interested at all in my material. And I kept talking to the head of the department. And I knew the head of the department and I were not aligned. And, again, back then I looked at things much more mainstream politically.
Hmm.
So I was looking at political views and I was like, I knew that we weren't aligned in that regard at all. But but he was so brilliant, the head of my department, and he was so engaging. Like he would push back and we would have a real discourse. And I
Right.
really, really enjoyed the conversation. My personal advisor, my direct thesis advisor, was not at all. And I knew we really like he was obsessed with Foucault. And even then, when I just didn't really know a whole lot, I just thought he was kind of boring, to be honest. And now,
Yeah.
in hindsight, he did predict some of the uh, scientism and the biological medical tyranny that would come down the pike. And in that regard, I think he did do some decent mourning, but a lot of it would just he thought it was so profound, and I just really he taught like 4 courses on it, and I just really didn't. It was just beyond me. I just really couldn't fathom why this was even interesting, and I thought it was actually kind of destructive philosophy.
Yep.
So, I sorry, this is a little bit of a tangent, but the reason I bring it up is because I now knowing what I know, the existentialists were just a rebranding of Marxism.
Yep.
And the more I started to study Marxism, I could not escape the fact that it was essentially satanic. I
Hmm.
mean, Marx himself wrote odes to Satan,
Yep.
and it is about inversion and distortion, deception,
And
and
mirrors.
manipulation. So, and of course, destruction, chaos, all of that. And but it's really interesting how, back then I saw it so differently, and I was definitely not a Marxist.
Mhm.
And in the psychology realm, I noticed it very quickly, and I was, turned off by that. But in the philosophy, I actually gravitated right towards the things that were essentially that, and I was deceived. So when you bring up Plato, I think I initially, and again, because I came at things from very much this, to like the Republican Democrat kind of a mindset, I had initially seen Plato as the, progenitor of the communist model, and
Yeah.
the Republic was kind of the, essentially the communist model. And that was initially how I saw Plato. And so that lens, I think, clouded a lot of my perspectives on his teachings and his writings. And now I have a much deeper, I have a lot more to uncover. I don't think I'm anywhere near being able to make it. I don't know I ever will make any kind of conclusive, uh, stances, but I see it a little bit more nuanced, because I do think he was working through a lot. And I
Mhm.
think that
Yep.
as most philosophers, we're reading it in hindsight as if it's been packaged in a nice little bow,
Right.
but
Right. Good
all of
point.
us are on a journey,
Yep.
right? So, any writer, if you read their earliest works and then you read their later works, there hopefully, if there are any kind of thinking authentic beings, there will be some sort of transition, there will be some sort of a evolution, and discoveries they make along the way, and they may change their perspective. So I think a lot of what we're watching when we read through Plato is him actually working through things, as I think is true with most philosophers, except for some of them who have a clear intentional agenda, and some of them do. But with Plato, I'm a little conflicted, because I think the biggest struggle I'm dealing with right
Oh
now
no.
is all right. So I think where I was at was, I was just saying that one of the biggest struggles I'm having with Plato currently is, I've been reading his, like, how he references the mystery schools,
Hmm.
and
Yep.
of course, his creation of the academy. And my big struggle is, did he, because he talks about the philosopher kings and how they should rule, so
Yep.
was he creating the academy to create a, upper class, ruling class of philosophy kings, or was he trying to teach the masses? And I think talked to Matt Ehret about this, and I
Yes, that
think
was a good one.
there's a valid argument to be made, I think, on both sides,
Yep,
but
for sure.
it's something I really struggle with. I don't know, because the other thing I struggle with is so much of the Greeks, where it was based on ancient Egyptian mystic
Big time.
philosophies, right? And I think my initial kind of bias was that, well, then it's bad, right? But I think that that's incorrect. I think that esoteric knowledge in itself is neutral. And
Absolutely.
I think that it's the fact that it's been occulted that makes it bad, because that enables it to be a controlling mechanism, a means of controlling the masses.
Actually, that's
So it's
exactly where
not,
I'm at.
it's not the nature of the esoteric knowledge itself, it's the fact that they are withholding it from the masses.
Well, that's funny that you mentioned that, because before we got on air and we were talking about a little bit off air in this book, the Secret Source. Literally, at the end of the book, that's exactly what's described. It's described as a form of, like, basically, it's like, once you figure out how to use the occult in your
Mhm.
favor, what we would call today like manifestation or this or that, or kind of controlling um, how you how you manifest stuff, then therefore you're in control of whomever you're discussing with, or however you're dealing with it. So basically it's saying, either we brainwash you, or we mind control you, or you mind control yourself. That's kind of the end of this book,
Right.
and what it's referring to, exactly what you just said. So it's not really the occult, it's how you apply it. So that's why, like, some of the techniques that are described in
Mhm.
a lot of the new age, let's call it, or new thought, a lot of the
Mhm.
techniques that are described can be used for good or can be used for evil. So I
Yeah.
think that point that you're just making right there is a pivotal point. And so, like, for example, like Napoleon Hill's Think and Grow Rich, those techniques do work. But
Sure.
do you use them for good? Do you
Sacred
use them for bad?
geometry is very real. I mean,
Absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely.
But it is. I think the question then becomes in whose hands does it fall? What do they do with it?
Right, exactly.
And how accessible is it? Does it become to others? I think this is where we see the manipulation of education and why that has become such a mechanism for controlling the masses. Because things like Common Core, if you like
Yep.
Plato said, you had to learn all of the
The
quadrivium. You know,
quadrivium.
you had
Yep.
to learn basic math and geometry, and right? Didn't he have like a plaque that says, unless if you are not a, I'm going to butcher it, paraphrase, but like, I mean, it's English anyway, so it would be paraphrased anyway, but something to the effect of, if you're not a geometer, you cannot come past the store. And, you know, so you had to know geometry and mathematics and grammar, rhetoric, logic, you know, basic foundational teachings before you could enter into the realms of things like political science.
Of course.
And
Yep.
yeah, whereas today it's very much the opposite. They teach you these very obscure types of really made up kinds of schools of thought. And I mean that they are kind of just made up. Things like
Absolutely.
queer study is a
Yep.
made up field, and
Absolutely.
it's a, you know, there, it's not predicated on anything that is rooted in anything. And they make these things up, but then they omit or they distort basic teachings like Common Core math instead of teaching, you know, traditional math. And it is because if you don't have that foundation, then how can you be equipped to then do higher advanced learning? And then you
Absolutely.
are much more susceptible to being controlled.
Yeah, that even fits into what you were discussing about Marxism and the Frankfurter
Mhm.
School in general, where basically everything can be objective, and there is no subjective truth. Sorry, subjective. Not nothing's objective.
Right.
At that
Right.
point, you can kind of mix and match things and slide what is real, what isn't real, what if it's real. And I remember having a conversation with someone telling me that there's no such things as truth, and I asked them, "Is that statement true?" And in that 1 second, that person's argument completely. I mean, it's a simple argument, but it really shows how you can just shift someone's opinion really quickly if you have no
Right.
solid ground to stand on.
Yes.
So
Yeah,
without the backing
absolutely.
of logic and all that, you can't actually think your way through life. You can't. Your perspective is in someone
Mm.
else's hands. It goes back to mind control.
Yes. Yeah. So, yeah, so I mean, that's kind of where I'm at with Plato. I also think it's interesting just the what you learn in school versus how many of his works are he's written, you know?
Yeah,
Like a lot of the ones that are very popularized, I think actually kind of indicate a lot l- less of what is interesting and relevant. But
agreed for sure.
yeah,
So it's probably a good opportunity to kind of slide into to John Coleman. It's kind of like
sure.
not that I mean, it does fit the conversation. It is about
Mhm.
psychology. It is about mind control, of course. Well, that's what the Tavistock
That's what he wrote.
Institute is all about. But how did you come into contact with John Coleman's work specifically?
So I had a friend who sent me a video years ago.
Hmm.
I think maybe it was in 2020. I'm trying to think, but he sent me a video of, it's like one of the few videos you can find of him talking about, uh, you know, the Committee of 300, and
Right. I
it's
know
one
the
of his
video.
longer speeches. Yeah, I'm sure you've seen this, read this video, and he sent me this video, and I was really enthralled. Like, I watched it a few times and I tried to find other information on him. And I stumbled on, you know, started finding some of his books. And then I found this Tavistock book.
Uh huh. Oh
And
yeah.
yeah. And then I read that one 3 times in a week. And yeah. That sent me down quite the rabbit hole. And I think just with the background in psychology, I really gravitated towards this notion of social engineering, you know, and a lot of these techniques, and this is why I say the philosophy psychology is very intertwined. You know, the techniques that they use, like they talk about the ancient philosophers talk about this, and it comes from the ancient mystics. You know, things like hypnosis, and
Hmm.
those are techniques that the psychologists then used for therapy, research, and also mind control.
Hmm.
And I was actually a hypnotherapist, one of my first jobs when I graduated from college, but I quit because I couldn't be hypnotized. And so I felt like a fraud. Um, but yeah, so
That's a good
I
thing.
think, yeah, but I was able to help people. So, it definitely has a place, as you were saying, it can be used for good or not. So, it was mostly for like habit formation. So there are people who were, working on things like quitting smoking and right, like that kind of thing. And I was definitely able to see some very positive results using it, but I just personally couldn't be hypnotized. So I felt like a fraud doing it. But yeah, so all this just to say that I think that's part of why I gravitated so much towards that work, because it was a very dark side of a field that I had spent so much of my life immersed in studying. So,
Well, so as you, because a lot of your interests kind of fit with like that one book kind of puts together your background with philosophy, your background and
mhm.
interest in psychology, and a lot of the names you've mentioned are all in the book. Like he often like talks about the Frankfurter School and Marxism and all that stuff. So as you started to kind of dive deeper in the world of John Coleman, how did that change your worldview? Because you said in the beginning you're kind of more about you believe that you can like vote your way out of this problem. And, vote harder. It's okay. Everything will be fine. How
Vote
did you go from
harder
that? Yeah, it works every time. You know what I
every
mean?
time.
So how did you go from like that to like reading that book, and then kind of, I would imagine you're walking around kind of looking at life in a completely different perspective, and how marketing fits into it, and why is it that you like this song, or why is it that you picked this shirt, and like these little things that you think are your choice. You start to read that book, or you start to go down the subject of what is social engineering, what is mind control, what is hypnosis, and how is it applied. You start to realize that,
Mhm.
oh, a lot of the decisions and choices I've made through my life are not actually mine. I was nudged in that direction, like Cass
Or
Silverstein.
rather than looking at it like quite so personally, like I was victimized and hypnotized. I don't know that I saw it that way, but what I definitely did start to see is that I think I always had this notion of culture being organic,
Yeah,
culture creation.
yeah.
And I think that's where the social engineering really opened my eyes to the puppeteers who are creating culture
Hmm.
and what their agenda behind that culture creation might be. So I think that was a really big perspective shift for me.
Hmm.
When you talk about like the vote harder kind of concept, I was very politically minded from a very young age. I started a board for school choice when I was in 6th grade, and so that like shows you how invested I've been for a lot of my life. My dad was I don't think I would have known this at the time, but in hindsight, he was very much a neocon. But I thought he was just
Yeah.
like a hardcore Republican conservative, but he was definitely very much a neocon. And my dad and I connected very much over politics. That was something we talked about a lot. So I think I felt like a lot of my this is what I talk about a lot when people have a hard time wrapping their heads around things like the secret societies and how the intelligence agencies and apparatus works. And what I try to explain to people is that you can have all these machinations, but honestly, what drives most people is interpersonal relationships.
Yes,
And
that's
that's
true.
part of why so much of this is predicated on trauma based mind control, on blackmail. That's how they leverage power, because
Hmm.
because humans are social beings, and our interpersonal relationships are often what drive us. And so for me personally, because that was one of my connections to my dad, I was very defensive of that stance. And I had a lot of people who planted seeds certainly in my early adult years, and I discredited them because my dad kept telling me that they were absolutely crazy nonsense talkers, and not to listen to them. But what I am grateful for is that, and it was very illuminating for me, because I now know this when doing my podcast, when talking to people who may not be awake, that those seeds do have power and
Yes.
they can grow. And that is really what happened for me, because I don't know that if I had a bit of like a moment of kind of starting to wake up. It was like, a big seed was planted around 2011 when I was writing for Politichicks and I started doing a deep dive into the Frankfurt School.
Yeah.
And it was the first time, because most of my life I grew up in a sea of leftists. So, I grew up right outside New York City, and then I was, then I lived in Manhattan for years, and then I was in LA. I was in the entertainment industry. I was in the fitness industry. It was a very leftist milieu.
Mhm.
And so it was just at some point much easier to say, I'm socially liberal but fiscally conservative. That was kind of like my go-to line, because it was much more palatable for a lot of people and in that leftist milieu. But when I started diving into the Frankfurt School, that was when I really had that eye-opening moment of realizing that you can't extricate one from the other, and that they're inexorably intertwined. And so that was a big paradigm shift for me. And I think at that point, I became much more openly conservative in my views. But when 2020 hit, and certainly when I stumbled upon Dr. John Coleman's work, that's really when I started to foray into the world of potential conspiracies. And it
Absolutely.
really because I had all those seeds had been planted, and I was able to start connecting dots. Like I remembered hearing things about, this data point. And all of a sudden, when I read that book, all of it really converged for me.
Me too.
And I started to realize there is a bigger agenda behind what's going on, and that it is not just that we're not going to solve this just by voting harder.
Absolutely, I had a similar sort of situation with me when I started. Because I ran, I think it was about 2009 or so when I'd heard about the Tavistock book. Because like in early conspiracy, whatever you want to call it, back in the day, people started talking more and more about John Coleman around 2005. But it was kind of
Mhm.
like in the background. I heard his name and I'm like, okay, yeah,
Right.
Media 300. I remember looking at all those charts with all the companies, and then how they the
Yeah.
Council of 13 and all that. And at that time I didn't really know what to make of a lot of the stuff that I was looking into. I was definitely going down the rabbit hole, but I didn't focus on his work at all. And when I finally sat down with the book, actually the book that I showed you earlier, a friend of mine gifted it to me before I left Canada, because he knew I was like really, I was really interested in the subject, and I was going to start going deep down this. And I had told him I'd been putting this off for a while. Like I knew there was something in there that's going to disturb everything that I believe. You know what I mean?
Right.
And with the Frankfurter School, I remember like hearing Cass Silverstein talking about nudge theory, and how like you could nudge populations into making decisions and this and that, like behavioral psychology, and how
Mhm.
he was connected to all of those behavioral psychologists, and the connected to the postmodernists and so on and so forth, and going further back to the Frankfurter School. But and I just kept thinking to myself, this sounds very similar to how MK Ultra is described. This sounds very similar to like the First Earth Battalion, which was like where they were trying to make Psy soldiers in the 60s, and like Frank Zappa and all the stuff that was going on in Laurel Canyon. And I just
Yeah.
didn't really think that it was all that connected. And then I started
Right.
reading the book, and I'm like, good God, this is all one plan that just looks like many, 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 many plans, but it's one plan. So it's
It's
pretty
one
trippy.
plan, but there are many players, and the
Yeah.
web is very intricate. And
Yes.
I do think people have, altering, multipolar initiatives within it. It's just
Absolutely.
that they tend to align because the overall worldview is very much aligned.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's quite the book, and he was quite the
Mhm.
character, and he just seems to be quite the mystery, because even looking into him, like trying to find out his backstory, or
Dr. John Coleman.
yeah, John Coleman.
Oh,
And
I have I mean, I have many of his books.
yeah,
I've found many of his interviews. Some of them I could only find like bootleg audio type interviews. There's no recording, at least that I can find, of how he died or when exactly he died.
right.
I can't seem to find any record of that anywhere.
Me
Um
neither.
yeah, and he was MI6.
Hmm.
So a lot of his writing is done from memory, because when you go into as intelligence, you have access to libraries that the masses don't, but you can only take notes, and then even your notes can be redacted. So
Go ahead.
so I'm not sure where I cut off, but I was saying that
He was going off memory because
yeah,
he's
because he was MI6, and so he had access to the libraries that the masses don't. And
Mhm.
so but when you're in those libraries, you can only take notes. But
Yep.
even those notes get approved and then are often redacted. So I was just saying that because he goes off memory, I think that's fascinating, but I also take it with a grain of salt because
Yes.
everybody's memory is valuable at some point. So you definitely, and people's memory is going to be clouded by their biases. So I do take that with a grain of salt, but he was clearly brilliant and clearly a wealth of information, and definitely opened my eyes to a a web that I really was not very familiar previously. So, and Tavistock is something I knew nothing about. So
Yeah.
I'd never heard of Tavistock before Dr. John Coleman. So
Well, you make a good point there about Coleman having to go off his memory and all that, because oftentimes he's criticized for a lot of that, and like,
yeah.
where's your sources and all that stuff. And Eustace Mullins criticizes him, and Lyndon LaRoche. They both of those guys kind of like claim that he plagiarized from him. But
Mhm.
how I feel when I hear that often, because you kind of hear that a lot in the
Mhm.
conspiracy world quite often. The way I
Yeah.
kind of approach it now is kind of like, listen, if whatever they wrote about or they're saying comes to pass and it kind of seems to be
Mhm.
accurate, take it, like you said, with a grain of salt, but kind of like
Right.
go through the material and see, well, he makes this statement, can you see it in the real world? Can you see the outcome, like, of what he said was going to happen? One
Right.
thing about John Coleman, which is why I tend to defend him, because I've had this debate, oftentimes people will disagree with his point of view, is like, well, listen, he said this and this, and that's exactly what I see in front of me. So whether he was,
He's
you
been
know,
right about a lot.
a
He's been,
lot,
yeah, a lot.
a
He
lot,
was right about a lot. So,
yeah.
I agree. Absolutely.
And
That's
that video that you're referring to, that interview, just the way he comes across, I mean, he might be a great actor, but he just seems so sincere, and he
yeah.
seems so caring, and it kind of feels almost like an uncle trying to like help you out, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
I mean, I've heard many interviews with him, and some of them were must have been towards the end of his life, and
yeah,
yeah, he did have kind of like a old grandpa kind of a feel to his voice
definitely.
at that point. But yeah, I think he was a great source of information, and definitely talking about things that were not discussed by that many people, but Tavistock in particular really was just kind of riveting, you know.
Yeah, me
And
too.
when you start diving into Tavistock, I mean, it was like it's like the mother of all think tanks. I mean,
Absolutely.
it's almost like they, the origins of social engineering. I mean, not the origins because certainly predates Tavistock's formal inception, but I definitely, as a organization, they were largely instrumental for the past 100 years.
Absolutely, because like now that I'm going through his book and Daniel Esselin's book and a few other documents that I've collected, some of which I've collected over the years, and I'm kind of actually going through all of it. I'm starting to
Yeah,
see like the subject of Tavistock is a good springboard for like many subjects
exactly.
in the quote unquote conspiracy world.
Hmm.
Whether it be who's controlling, even back to the ancient past, because you can start. Connecting the Venetians and like the royal families, and you can just keep going back, right, even to like Templars. So
Yep.
there is a direct line going backwards, and there's definitely a line going forwards. And
Sure.
then as you keep reading the book, as I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, you start to realize how much their work, if you want to call it that, at Tavistock has affected all of our lives. I mean, clearly we're living it right now, like we're
Oh
living
yeah.
the shock, of it
Huge,
all.
huge impact. Yeah, the trauma-based mind control, and I do think
Yeah,
that a lot of their research was the uh I guess it created the blueprint for MK Ultra.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
There's a direct line between their work and MK Ultra, most certainly. And even if you look at it from like the educational standpoint and SRI, and like right now, I'm as you know, I'm doing a deeper dive than I had in the past on changing images of man. And like that document, actually, that's the document that really got me, like shook me. It shook me. I gave a little talk.
It's shaking. It's so
It's
dark.
Oh my God. And it's so many of the individuals that are in the quote unquote new age world either reference many of the individuals in that book or people that were behind the book or
Right.
directly are influenced from them. Like, I don't want to reveal too much because I want to start kind of like,
Yeah.
presenting about that. But the thing about that document, and actually Daniel Eshel, when he starts his book, he starts of Tavistock, he starts
Hmm.
with referencing the two documents, Changing Images of Man and the
And
Aquarian
the age
Conspiracy.
Aquarius. Yeah.
And you really see it. And I mean, um, not to go off on a tangent, but I recall back in the day, for the early conspiracy theorists, there was like the whole 2012 stuff. But before that, in the late 90s, there was the whole Y2K, the whole
Oh yeah.
Y2K scare. So now I look back because I'm old enough to remember like that, the shock of all of that, the possibility. Oh my God, Y2K. I look back
Hmm.
reading Tavistock and I'm like, oh my God, this is like they're writing how they came up with this idea of all these bizarre moments in our history where they're going to scare the crap out of us. So when it's like 2012, when I started looking back at like the Mayan calendar and the end of the world and all that kind of stuff, when I
Right.
look at it from through the lens of those documents, I could see clearly that it was completely engineered, like the shock value of it. Not there. I mean, there are
Sure.
some things about that subject that are true-ish, but just the way it was presented to the public is what I mean. Like
Yeah.
how that subject was presented to the public, it really turned people's minds on and off. And
Sure.
it's pretty remarkable how easily molded we are if we're not in control of how we view things.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, it's not so much if yeah, I mean, in control of how we view things, but I think it's really if we don't have the critical thinking capacity. So if we don't have
Absolutely.
the ability to ask the questions and the foundation to be able to ask important questions and valuable questions, it's not
Yes,
just the questions; it's what kind of questions are you asking, and
that's right.
and that's why there is the overlap with the psychology and education. And the education system has been geared towards obedience and compliance rather than towards critical thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. Because like you build your perspective on how you logically think through things and how you perceive the world is based on the questions you asked. Exactly like you said. Because the talk that I gave earlier this last year, I started off by a quote that I often use to remind myself or to keep me grounded, which is the right answer to the
Hmm.
wrong question remains a wrong answer. Ask better questions and like really focus on the question.
Hmm.
And that kind of got me through. I guess I can't say I'm out of it, but the beginnings
Hmm.
of rethinking how I'm seeing things is that one quote kind of giving me perspective, or it's helping me keep my some solid ground. You
Right.
know what I mean? Because it gets shaky. It gets shaky out there with all this craziness going on, man. It's nuts.
Totally. Totally. Yep.
So, I wanted to ask you a few more questions before we tie this up because I know
Yeah.
we're probably going to have some more conversations down the
Yeah, for
road.
sure.
So, from your perspective, where do you want your research to go in this whole Tavistock thing? For me, it's more about like new age deception, and
Yeah.
I want to do a deep dive on that from where it begins and the psychology of it.
Hmm.
And for you, what interests you on the whole subject of the
Yeah, and I
Tavistock
think
Institute?
that end of it is fascinating because I think that very much has a Luciferian
Hmm.
uh, angle and origin. Um, and I mean, where I would want to go, I think obviously, I think it does as well. But I think really, I'd like to. I'm interested in kind of the origin of social science
Hmm.
and the manipulation of social science fields because I think it's really been deceptively presented as a science, and
Yes.
it's really not a science.
Yes.
And it is, and I will qualify this by saying that, I'm not suggesting that psychology has never helped anyone or that nobody has ever benefited from talk therapy or even from psychiatry. But I really do feel that the field of psychology, the more I dive into it, was created as a secular solution to spiritual problems. And that is a means of, certainly funneling patients to be pharmaceutical, um, you know, uh, clients forever,
Yep.
perpetual pharmaceutical clients for the field of psychiatry. But I also think that it really it shapes the culture, because people are no longer, they're atomized. I mean, think about it. When you're in a therapist's office, you're siloed by yourself with the therapist.
Yep.
You basically turn over your power. I mean, think about hypnosis as an
Mhm.
example. You're practically unconscious, and the therapist has all this power. I know there are certain fields of psychology where they have endowed more power to the patient, but a lot of it, I mean, like regression therapy, there's so many types of therapies where the therapist can actually do a lot of damage and program their patient.
Absolutely.
And it's you're separated from other people. And that can make you feel worse. That's, we know that as social beings, we saw that with the social distancing and people locking down, and how depressed and anxious did people become, right? So I think that whereas there used to be, I'm not saying there aren't problems with religious institutions, of course, that'd be a whole other conversation, but at least the notion of having uh, these conversations where you're dealing with, whether it be a priest, a rabbi, whoever your spiritual guidance is. And of course, confession can be done in privacy, but then you have a community, right? And a
Yep.
lot of these things are worked through and talked through. A lot of, there's a deference to the elders, and it's just it changes the whole structure of society now when you have this field where all this power is entrusted to the experts
Absolutely. Yep.
instead of community, instead of family, instead of elders who you respect and know. So I could go on and on about it, but I just think that it is a really a bigger part of a much more sinister plan to social, and then of course all the trauma based mind control, and then leading up to MK Ultra, which was not just uh, a tragic occurrence on the individuals who were afflicted, but also really kind of a beta test for a lot of mass scale trauma based mind control. And I think a lot of that is still going on today, whether it's, under the name of MK Ultra or not, is kind of irrelevant.
No, absolutely, and you can kind of see the outcome of those early experiments. Even if you look at it from the Vietnam War, the experiments that they
Hmm.
did on soldiers there, whatever, you kind of
Hmm.
see them. They're kind of doing a lot of this stuff to us in a bizarre sort of way.
Yeah.
This has been a long, drawn out plan of theirs. Uh,
And when you look at the funding entities behind it, I mean, it's all the
yes,
same people. I mean,
yes,
it's the
yes,
Rockefellers, the
yes,
Rothschild, the Milners,
yes.
the Crown. It's always the same groups. So
Yeah, even like this, the having Sigmund Freud, and then Bernays, his nephew, and then you have was his Mark Bernays Rudolph, who owns Netflix,
Netflix,
and all of a sudden you're like, this can't be a coincidence here. That's pretty interesting that you're all literally describing the same form of techniques to change people's opinions and shift their ways and like culture create whatever society you want.
right?
How does the Luciferian stuff fit into that for you? Like, how do you see that? Because that's something that a lot of people talk about. Like, I mean, especially with what just happened at the Super Bowl and all the other stuff that's
Mm,
happened in the last little while.
right.
In your perspective, how do you view that? Because you oftentimes you hear about like Satanists and Luciferians, and people kind of make this very cartoon, like you know what I mean? Like they really
Yeah.
play it up. How do you see it? How do you view this?
Well, I think it's multifaceted, but some of the teachings are literally derived from more Luciferian type of teachings and views.
Hmm.
So, like Carl Jung was a mystic, right?
Yep.
Arguably, he was a part of the occultic world. and
Absolutely.
his view was very Luciferian. He's
Hmm.
just one example. I mean, I think we could go through so many of them, but I think he's a great example because he's known as such a, forerunner in the field. But, when you think about his collective unconscious, isn't
Yes.
that kind of like a homage to the monad,
It
right? And
is.
the
Yes.
demiurge,
That's right.
and that we're all one. And
Yep.
And I think there is this polarity, and I think this is just what's so hard for humans to reconcile. But it is the one and the many. But if you have a more biblical type of worldview, and that doesn't mean you have to be a religious person to grasp this. I'm just
Hmm.
saying that framework does tend to lend itself to, there is the one and the many. There
Hmm.
is it's both. We are very much individuals, and we have individual purpose and uh, consequences and choices. We have free will, and yet everything is interconnected. And I think, certainly science and just even empirical experience points in that direction. But
Absolutely.
right, but I think their worldview is very much about, as I said, that I think that's just one example, and it comes from a very new agey, which is a Luciferian. It's kind of a popularized branding of a Luciferian worldview. So I
Absolutely.
think that's one way. I think another way is that you're opting out of the religious viewpoints. So again, it's not that you have to be a religious person, but now this is taking you outside of that framework into a more secular framework, and now you're again worshiping man, right? Who's now
Yep.
going to save you? It's man, and that again, I think is a very Gnostic, Luciferian viewpoint, but it's done in a deceptive way where you're becoming enlightened, and I think that's a lot of the path for a lot of these psychologists, certainly in the earlier years. And then there's also just all this very perverted kind of stuff, from like Eric Fromm and Herbert Marcuse and
Yes. Yes.
Freud for sure. And it does seem like very reminiscent of a lot of the occultic kind of uh, perverse worshiping and rituals. So yeah.
Absolutely. You make a lot of great points there, actually. Yeah, going back to Carl Jung, that was like how entered the whole world of Hermeticism, actually, because if
Hmm.
you look at his catalog, he's got quite a few books on the occult, and he has a book called Hermeticism. And
Hmm.
the whole idea of archetypes is pretty much the tarot, and the way that he kind of, like you just said, the collective unconscious and the whole idea of oneness at face value, it sounds great. Like you're like, oh yeah, we're all
Sure.
one. But then when you don't look at it, you're like, wait, this is a collectivist point of view. This is not at all telling you to be responsible for you. Like you are responsible for you. And you
Right.
make a very good point there. And that's something that you constantly, continuously see in the new age. And it is at its heart a Luciferian doctrine.
Yes. And the other interesting thing about Carl Jung is he was a double agent.
Yes.
088, I believe was his number.
Yeah.
And yeah.
I think.
And so, I mean, so he was a product of the, OSS and the Nazis. And so they have all those ties too. So,
Yeah, it's a little disheartening because when you find out a lot of these guys are all in on it on a bizarre way of the trying to confuse you.
mhm.
Yeah, it kind of sucks, but for me at least,
Yeah.
because I really loved a lot of these guys back in the day. Like it was, yeah,
And I think where I've come to is that it doesn't mean that everything they said is,
right,
nefarious or wrong uh or devoid of value.
true,
I always say if only people spent as much time adjudicating information as they do vilifying or glorifying a source, we would
good point,
be as a society in a very, very different place. I mean,
good point,
something that is the most inherently wrong or even evil still can offer tremendous wisdom. So
absolutely,
for people, like, just because the mystery schools used a lot of those teachings later were then I mean, I wasn't there, but I know I've certainly read of those inspiring a lot of uh black magic that's been
hmm,
weaponized, right?
yep,
And that doesn't necessarily mean everything they taught was inherently bad or wrong. It
Of
means that
course.
in the wrong hands, it can be very, very dark. So, yeah, so I think that that's kind of one of the big things that I'm really trying to impart to people,
Hmm.
is that it's not about the information itself. It's not even about the tool itself. It's not, technology itself is neutral. It's
Yep.
what is done with that. I don't want a transhuman, post-human world. That's not, to me, that is, I think that's also very Luciferian.
Absolutely.
Um, and it's not, I don't see that as the best evolution for man. But somebody who has been, quote unquote, illuminated, I use that word intentionally, they do see it that way. They see that
Hmm.
that's the next logical progression. And, there are some of them are just genuinely psychopaths and they
Hmm.
exist. And some of them are really misled, deceived people, I believe, because I don't share that worldview. I don't know. I don't claim to have access to the absolute truth. I can only do my best to seek it. But in my perspective, I think they're deceived and they're following a path that is a false light. But
Absolutely. Hence the name Lucifer. It's like,
but
yeah, it also like
Lily
blinded
Bear,
by the
right?
light, that the whole song, and that's kind of like their shtick. That's how they kind of get through it. And even like with going back to transhumanism, you see, this has been attempted a couple times, because at the end of every civilization, not every civilization, but many, usually at the tail end of it, you kind of get this hermaphrodite sort of situation going on.
Yes.
And you see it with the Greeks, you saw it with the Romans, and then where we're leaving it now. And then another thing is, like, usually I can't remember where I read this. They're like towards the end of civilizations, you
Did,
find chefs
didn't
become sorry.
oh sorry, didn't the ancient Egyptians have one too?
True. Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah.
And then even right down to Baphomet, right?
Yep.
And like, and it's, you always find at the tail end of a civilization, they I don't remember where I read this, where they say that they glorify chefs, they make them celebrities, they make blood sport popular, so like the gladiator games and UFC, and then they start to make this hermaphroditic like imagery and statues and feminize men and masculate women and kind of combine them together. And it almost feels like, I don't know, but it almost feels like right now they're taking those, like our ancients used them as concepts, and now they're actually trying to physically make them with this whole trans movement. And it's pretty I didn't really think I'd see this in my lifetime. I'm gonna tell you, like, straight. Like, I remember back in the day when I'd read some of the stuff, I was like, I saw some of the Luciferian slash satanic stuff as more like reading mythology, more
Right.
like a. I didn't really think like they full on did this kind of stuff. I mean, later I realized they did, but now that
Yeah.
I'm seeing it in my own time with this thread of transgenderism like all over the place and all that, I'm like, dude, they've done this before. The hermaphrodite is like, it's the alchemical marriage. It's in alchemy. It's called the alchemical
Exactly.
marriage,
Yep.
and it's scary to see like a story become reality. If that kind of makes sense.
It's dark. Well, because it's a
Yeah,
dark story. You're not watching unicorns and puppies and whatever. It's Care Bears. It's a very dark story. So, I mean, that's not to say that I don't think that there's hope, or that I do actually have tremendous hope for humanity, and I do think in the end it works out. I don't know what it'll be like in the meantime. I think it might get worse before it gets better, but yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely. And it's very important to keep hope and to kind of focus on solutions,
Hmm.
as well as understanding like the map that you're on and kind of looking at the world around you, but at the same time
Right.
kind of concentrate on solutions. And one other thing, I mean, it came up in our conversation a couple of times. We can, like, not that everything they're teaching is necessarily negative, it's your approach on
Mhm.
how you use it. Like, you could use a gun to feed your family, protect your family, or you can go around killing people. And a lot
Right.
of the stuff that's in these things that we call black magic, white magic, whatever you want to call it, it almost seems like they wouldn't be studying it if there wasn't something about it that was functional. You know what I mean?
Right.
And clearly they have been studying it, and then you can trace it back to where they're like, well, they're actually sponsor someone to study it, which is what
Totally.
I think the Tavistock Institute is kind of based on. Is like, they're so we can reverse engineer their tricks. Like with music,
Right.
we know music can put us into a hypnotic state and change
Totally.
your frame of mind, and we can make our own music. I mean, I'm a musician.
And
I
I
hope
think
it's
that's really part of why that field is so fascinating to me, and why I want to dive into that research and expose it, because they're using, I mean, the field of political science was created out of the social sciences, and Tavistock created the whole method of polling, which we think of as revealing the opinions of, statistical valuations, when in reality what they're doing is manipulating the perceptions of people.
That's right.
And this was outlined in their manuscripts. They talked about it. This isn't like a conjecture or speculation or a conspiracy theory. They actually, in their own words, this is what they said. And they use those tools to manipulate so much of the perceptions and the different fields that we are now so immersed in. So people, yeah, I mean, political science was just, one example, but it's a very powerful one. So
Absolutely.
I'm hoping that by drawing exposing the genesis and the funding connections and the just the lineage, I'm hoping that by uncovering that, and then possibly by sharing, what I find, to be possibly some of the, even if I can't prove the intent, at least the results, that maybe we can reverse engineer some of it. Because, like I said, I think the tools, certainly, I mean, psychology has some very powerful benefits, and some people have really had miraculous results with it. But there's also a lot of dark players who definitely had an agenda to socially engineer the masses. And yeah, that's not so good.
Absolutely, and like you're right, because poli sci and like the entry points of psychology, most average people don't really think of the things that we're discussing today. So to them, it's kind of like going, like you gave like it's almost like going to a priest. I think that
Yeah.
you're mentioning that earlier. It's kind of like they're going to their own version of a secular religion, and
Yes.
it
Which
replaces
it
that.
is.
Yeah, it's because like they remove the ideas and concepts of God or thinking of the individual or all that, and that void has to be replaced with something. So they'll pull that out and they'll replace it with something. And usually, what they replace it with isn't for our benefit. It's usually,
Yeah.
yeah.
Uh,
So, getting to the tail end of it, and I do want
yeah.
you to tell everybody about the stuff that you're working on, because one of your projects does fit with reverse engineering this, and that's you're putting on a little concert. So, I want to hear about that and a lot of the other stuff that you got going on in the world of Courtney Turner.
All right. Yeah. So we'll start with that. I'm doing an event. It is right now we're calling it Rebels with a Cause, although we're looking into the URL, so it might be changed slightly. But Cause stands for Creative Artists Uniting for the Sovereignty of Everyone, and it is going to be, as of tomorrow, we'll lock in the event, but it looks like it's going to be June 3rd. It is going to be a day and a half event, and it's really just artists for liberty collaborating. So we've got some really great bands already interested. We have several speakers and panels. I'm an aerial acrobatic artist, so I will be performing and speaking. So definitely that will be on my website as soon as we get that locked in. So hopefully by the end of this week, possibly the beginning of next week, we should have that, and that will be on my website. You can start getting some early bird tickets, because I think we're going to probably do a discounted for some early bird people. If we sell out, we're going to expand. So it really may turn into a whole festival. So, and the plan is for that to go on tour and really be kind of a movement to inject freedom-minded people into the culture and freedom messaging into the culture. So other than that, I have several things going on. I have the Courtney Turner podcast. I spell my name like Courtenay, Courtenay, Turner. Podcast. You can find me at CourtneyTurner.com, and that'll have links to all the social medias and all the different audio and video platforms on which you can find my podcast. I also have the Pirate Stream Media, which we started a show called Dialectical Dissidence, and that is with the great guys at the Last American Vagabond, Brian Christian, and Rebunk News, Scott Armstrong. And Scott is also working with me on this event. That will be on June 3rd. So that is that show. And then we have not aired yet, but we're about to, and it's a roundtable discussion group, a women's roundtable discussion group. I say it's a counter to The View, but really we have nothing in common with The View except that it is women discussing culture and, yeah, but we do more of like crypto history. We
Oh yeah.
definitely conspiracy. We definitely talk about culture and, and of course, like women's issues and that kind of thing. So that's a really fun show. And then I have my show, Whim, What is Movement, which is about to launch on the way forward. And so I will have a link where those who you can join the way forward and get a discount if you come through my Whim show. It's Whim, What is Movement? And we explore ways that movement helps you to heal emotionally, mentally, physically, and spiritually. And then I also have, we're about to get started, I think in March. We're still brainstorming on the name, but I have a show I've done a couple of episodes with my friend Rachel Wilson, and we're going to be launching. So I don't know how many shows that is, but I'm busy.
You certainly are, and I really do appreciate your work and everything you do.
Thank
You
you.
actually are definitely one of the podcasts I push on people the most. There's like
Well, thank you.
I have about 7 or 8, and you're definitely on that list. And
Oh, I'm so honored. Thank you.
yeah,
I
no,
really
definitely,
appreciate that.
definitely. Well,
Yeah.
Courtney, thank you so much for coming on the show. I apologize for all the technical difficulties.
That was weird.
Sorry. It was weird. I don't know what the hell that's all about. It's funny. I remember reading back in the day where people would comment that when they would mention the Tavistock Institute in message boards, they'd get kicked out or things would happen weird. And so I don't know if that's what it was, but it definitely feels weird.
It was definitely weird. Yeah. I'm like debating whether I should say this because it might get logged off. But yeah. So maybe I'll save it for after, and if you want to share it, you can. But
Definitely want to hear it.
yeah.
Definitely want to hear it. Okay, Courtney, thank
You
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 so
want?
much.
Okay. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, say it on here. Yeah, I would love for you to say it
Oh,
on here. I
I was
thought you
gonna
didn't
say
want to
so.
say it.
Yeah. No, I mean, I've shared this story before, but when I was 7 years old, the CIA tried to recruit me, and
Really?
yeah, so I always like kind of make the joke about like if they have this like open file on me. I mean, really just joking. My mom is not very she's not nearly as seeped in all, although now she listens to my podcast, so I probably can't say that anymore. But at the time, she was definitely not nearly as far down the conspiracy rabbit hole as I was. And when I said it to her, I was expecting her to reassure me and be like,
Yeah.
"Courtney, that's ludicrous. Of
Yeah.
course they don't have like this was so long ago, it was decades ago." And her immediate response was, "Oh no, definitely." I was like,
Really? Wait, hold
"I
on.
don't know.
You
I mean,
left this for the end of
honestly."
the podcast? I want to hear more about this.
Honestly, I don't think so, but every time like something like that happens, I'm like, "Oh."
Yeah. It is. It was weird, and maybe we could talk more about the CIA and you later. Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much for coming on, and I really do appreciate you giving me your time. I know like you're crazy busy as you just listed all the millions of things you do, so I appreciate you.
I thank you so much. I appreciate you, and this was super fun. So I look forward to more conversations.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.